Arthur. I'm the King Arthur guy, and this is episode 9. Now, you'll remember back in episode 2, I said that I wasn't going to keep going indefinitely. I was just going to keep going until I ran out of things to say, and I didn't know how many episodes I was going to be in. Well, I'm starting to run out of things to say, so I'm going to do this episode and the next episode, and if I wrap up everything I want to say in the next episode, then that'll be it. So there might be another one after that, but it depends on how much I can fit into the next episode. So this one is going to cover the period from Arthur's death, which I date to around the year 520, to the death of the ruler Melwyn, which we are told was in 547, according to the British history, the Welsh annals, pardon me. Now, as I said, that they had a central government, so everyone else says that this was high kingship, and they just didn't have high kings in between Arthur and Melwyn. But according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, this was a central government, and they did have rulers of the central government in that period. And Gildas criticized 5 kings who were alive at the time he wrote the book. So people think that Geoffrey just took these names from Gildas and insisted that they were rulers of the central government when they weren't, but I think they actually were, even though Geoffrey is very unreliable. He wrote the history of the kings of Britain in the 1130s, and he was a storyteller, not an historian. He passed himself off as an historian, but I think in this case he did get the gist of it right, even if not everything he said was true. Now, I believe that the political system that the Britons were using was based on the Romans, a system in which the ruler had to maintain the support of the army. And I believe this because what we have here is a situation in which of several kings who ruled only for a few years and then were overthrown, a phenomenon which is most likely to have happened in the Roman-style system, because the ruler had to maintain the support of the army. So if the army became discontented, it could swing its support to someone else, especially if that someone else was handing out donatives to the troops. Donative is a fancy Latin word for bribe. Anyway, the information we have on these kings comes from Geoffrey, who's unreliable, and also from Gildas in his book, The Ruin and Conquest of Britain, and unfortunately I think that Gildas is also unreliable. But anyway, I'm going to put forward the information we have and try and make as much sense of it as I can. Now, Gildas also associated each of these kings with a particular beast: lion, leopard, bear, dragon. Now, it's widely regarded that he got these creatures from the book of Revelations in the Bible, and he was using them to criticize these men, which is quite possible, but it's also quite possible that these were their symbols, because these creatures also appear in heraldry. Well, heraldry as such didn't exist yet, but the beginnings of it was starting. They did use specific symbols, often fierce animals, to identify them. You know, the kings would use these animals to identify them on the battlefield, on banners, and sometimes painting on shields as well. The two ideas are not mutually exclusive. All right, now, so we'll start with the realm that we're dealing with. So I believe that Arthur didn't simply stop the Anglo-Saxons with the Battle of Badon Hill. I think he conquered all of their territory, or at least forced them to submit, so that his authority extended over all of what is now England, Wales, and Scotland, as far north as the Firth of Forth. According to Breton tradition, he also held authority over Brittany, which is possible. Arthur is said to have been based in Dumnonia, Somerset, Dorset, Devon, and Cornwall. The northern part of Brittany was called Domnonia. It's almost exactly the same pronunciation, just slight difference. And we know that the two regions were ruled by different branches of the same family. So it's possible that Arthur could have gotten a foothold in Brittany through Domnonia and then extended his authority. I'm not saying that that's what he actually did. I'm merely saying that it's possible so much missing information, it's difficult to reach firm conclusions on a lot of these things. So anyway, Arthur would have been killed in battle, the Battle of the Field of Camblen, around the year 520, according to my calculations. And as I said, he was killed by Melgwyn and Medrot, who switched sides and joined Melgwyn, but after Arthur's death, Melgwyn had a fit of remorse and went into a monastery. So the next ruler was Constantine, who, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, was Arthur's cousin. He said that Constantine had to deal with a rebellion from the Saxons and from Mordred's two sons. Now I should point out that the medieval Welsh used the term Saxon to refer to all of the Anglo-Saxons. So he wasn't just saying, oh, the Saxons rebelled, but the Angles and Jutes didn't. He was just using it as a general term. Now Constantine is said to have successfully put down the rebellion, and Mordred's two sons fled, one to Winchester, the other to London. Constantine fled after them, chased after them. He killed the one in Winchester in an altar in a church, in front of an altar in a church. The other, the one in London, he slew in a monastery. Now, this is clearly based on something that Gildas said. It's obvious that Geoffrey read Gildas, but it's also obvious that he did not have Gildas in front of him when he wrote his book, because some of the things get a little garbled up. Now, Gildas referred to Constantine as whelp of the filthy lioness of Dumnonia, and said that he disguised himself as an abbot and slew two young men, princes, in front of two of their mothers, their biological mother, but also the mother church, in killing them in front of an altar in a church. So it's possible that Geoffrey had two different versions. One told him that this happened at Winchester and the other at London, so in order to accommodate both, he had the two men split up. But it's clearly based upon Gildas's version. Now, according to Gildas, Constantine also killed one of his parents. This is all the information we have on his reign. According to Geoffrey, it lasted for 4 years. Now, you'll remember, I believe that the Britons had factions, and that Arthur, Vortigern, and apparently Constantine were in a moderate faction. They were trying to find an accommodation between the Britons and the Romans, or at least that's how the faction started, whereas the other main faction was Roman. So it's not surprising that the next name on the list is Aurelius Caeninus. Now, Gildas told us that he lived in the time period of Ambrosius Aurelianus's grandchildren, and it's widely regarded that the similarity of the names, Ambrosius Aurelianus, Aurelius Caeninus, that Caeninus was probably one of these grandchildren. So this would mean that the Roman faction had come to power. So, according to Geoffrey, Aurelius Caeninus was brave. He killed his uncle, or rather overthrew his uncle in a civil war, and imprisoned his uncle and killed the uncle's two sons. This seems to have been a confusion with something that Gildas said about Melgwyn, the last king on the list. Gildas referred to Aurelius Caeninus as a lion, and said that he committed adultery and fought civil wars, and was also guilty of killing one of his parents, but Gildas didn't tell us which one. He loved to use the word parricide, just say that they killed the parent instead of giving us any information on it. See, Gildas assumed that his audience knew what he was talking about. Anyway, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, Aurelius Caeninus' reign lasted for 3 years. So, at this point, I think the political situation starts to become much more confused. Both of the two main factions have been overthrown, so new factions were starting to emerge, or at least factions that had been weaker were starting to become stronger and more significant. So next up we have Vortepor. Okay, so according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, he had to deal with another Saxon rebellion, and they brought in reinforcements from Germany. Gildas's account on Vortepor is very interesting. First of all, he called him Tyrant of the Demetae. Now, you will remember back in episode 7, when I was talking about the campaigns during Arthur's time period, that the dominant position is that Dyfed in southwestern Wales was not liberated from the Irish in this time period, but would only be liberated in the 10th century, and I disagreed with that. One of the reasons I disagreed with that is because I made the case that Gildas was a Roman bigot, and Gildas said that Vortepor was the bad son of a good king, the good king being Agricola. So clearly, since Gildas only liked Romans, Agricola must have been Roman, not Irish. Another reason is that Gildas did refer to Vortepor as Tyrant of the Demetae, whereas the Irish in Dyfed were the Diesi. These types of designations were very precise. If the Irish were dominant, then Gildas would have called him Tyrant of the Diesi. By saying Demetae, he was saying that the Britons were dominant. Anyway, Gildas said that Vortepor was spotted in wickedness like a leopard, and told us that he assaulted his own daughter. Now, he would have reigned for approximately 3 years. Next, we come to Cuneglassas, who's not in Geoffrey's account. Now, I believe that this is because Cuneglassas was not ruler of the central government, but was Melgwyn's right-hand man. And this comes from a couple of things that Gildas said. First of all, he referred to Cuneglassas as charioteer of the bear's stronghold. So this is how Cuneglassas is associated with the bear from the Book of Revelations. However, the bear's stronghold is an actual place. It's Dinarth. And Melgwyn was king of Gwynedd. Cuneglassas was his cousin. And Cuneglassas' father, Owen Whitetooth, was also associated with Dinarth. So since they were based at Fort Bear, or the bear's stronghold, it's quite probable they used a bear as their symbol. Now, the fact that he's called a charioteer is interesting, because by this point, chariots were no longer used for warfare. However, they were used for chariot races and sports, and they were also used for parades. So, if Melgwyn was going to appear in a parade, he would have been in a chariot, but he wouldn't have been the charioteer himself. Somebody else would have done that. So I think that Cuneglassas held the honor of being Melgwyn's charioteer. Gildas told us that Cuneglassas means red butcher, when actually it means grey dog, so he's just doing a deliberate mistranslation in order to attack him. Now, he also said that Cuneglassas fought in civil wars and waged war with weapons unique to himself. Now, what does that mean? There's only one thing that I could think of, and that would be the siege engines. They would be unique because the engines themselves would have been very expensive to build, and the men who looked after the siege engines, maintained them and used them, were highly specialized, and therefore commanded a high salary. So they would have been very expensive. So it's likely that only the central government could have maintained any kind of siege train. So I believe that Melgwyn was the ruler of the central government. Cuneglassas, being his right-hand man, was not only had the honor of being his charioteer, but also the honor of commanding the siege train in war. Now, according to Gildas, Cuneglassas divorced his wife. In those days, that would have been viewed as a sin. And he also chased after, but does not seem to have actually caught, his ex-wife's sister, who was a nun. And Gildas, of course, was very scandalized by that. So last up, we have Melgwyn, or Malgo, as Geoffrey called him. According to Geoffrey, he was handsome, generous, brave, although Geoffrey did criticize him for being a homosexual, which in those days was considered a sin. I want to make it very clear, I don't consider it a sin. I'm not homophobic. I'm just saying that that's the way they would have viewed it back in the 12th century. Okay. Anyway, other sources tell us that, yes, Melgwyn was not only noted for being good looking, but also tall. So Gildas referred to Melgwyn as Dragon of the Island, and said that he had deprived other kings of their lands, and some even of their lives, and was greater than other kings not only in stature, but in power. He went on about how God had granted him this great power, but he was abusing this power. Now this is an interesting passage. First of all, again, so Melgwyn is associated with the dragon, but again, this indicates that this was probably Melgwyn's armorial badge, because he was king of Gwynedd, and the dragon was associated with Gwynedd. The red dragon of Wales is derived from the badge of Melgwyn's direct descendant, Cadwaladr, who ruled in Gwynedd in the second half of the 7th century. Now, in an earlier episode, I did say that the idea of the red dragon representing Wales came from this legend that is recorded in British history, the two dragons, the red and the white. Technically, that's true. That's the first time that the red dragon is used to represent all of the Welsh. Before that, it was associated mainly with Cadwaladr and the House of Gwynedd in general. I just wanted to clarify that. Anyway, it's interesting that the Britons also often use the term dragon as a synonym for ruler. So this phrase, Dragon of the Isle, is often interpreted to mean the island of Anglesey. I don't agree with that at all. I think it's the island of Great Britain. But the argument runs that, well, they were politically divided in these different kingdoms, and they had high kings, and Gwynedd had very limited power. So Anglesey was part of Gwynedd, and it was an important base for the kings of Gwynedd. Yeah, well, it may have been, but it wasn't associated with Melgwyn. Melgwyn was associated with a different part of Gwynedd called Ross. That's where he had his main palace. That's where he was buried. Furthermore, the rest of the passage is all about how powerful he was, how he could depose other kings and kill them, and how he had greater power than any of the other kings. This is clearly indicating that Melgwyn was the most powerful king in Britain. So the island referred to is not likely to be the island of Anglesey at all. It is far more likely to be the island of Great Britain. Anyway, Gildas told us that Melgwyn killed the king, his uncle, and his warriors in a civil war. I argued that this is a reference to the Battle of the Field of Camlan. Then he went into a monastery. Then he came out of the monastery. Well, I think he came out of the monastery precisely because these other kings couldn't last. They kept being deposed. They tried to go with or continue with the moderate faction of Constantine, who only lasted 4 years, and he was overthrown. Then Aurelius Caeninus, who only lasted 3 years, of the Roman faction. Then Vortipor, I don't know what faction he was in, but he's only supposed to have lasted about 3 years as well. They couldn't get a king or a ruler who could last for any length of period, any length of time. So I think that Melgwyn was persuaded to come out of the monastery because he appears to have been the only one to gain enough support to create any kind of a stable government. Now, according to Gildas, Melgwyn then married, which Gildas found shocking because he's supposed to have been a monk, but he broken his vows. He lived with his wife for years and then murdered his wife, murdered his nephew so that he could marry the nephew's widow. And apparently the widow was in on this plot. This is not found in any other traditions connected to Melgwyn, and I don't believe that it's true. It might be true, but you gotta remember, you can't trust Gildas. You also have to remember the way politics worked in those days, that marriages were often dynastic in nature. And, they had a very bad grasp of medicine. It was very violent. It's possible that Melwyn's wife's death and the death of his nephew were not part of any kind of a plot at all. They may have taken place sometime around each other, within the same month or whatever, and that may have raised some suspicions. But that could be just a coincidence. Now, if the nephew's marriage was a dynastic marriage, and the parties involved wanted to send the message that whatever treaty it was still enforced, then the nephew's widow would have been married off to another member of the family. So it's possible that this second marriage was political and not the result of any kind of sinister plot. As I said, Gildas is the only person to tell us this story. But we love a juicy story of murder and forbidden passion and all that kind of thing. You'd think that if there was something behind it, it would have been repeated instead of being ignored. Well, anyway, that's pretty much all I've got. So Melwyn is said to have died around the year 547, in the year 547. That's according to the Welsh annals. And he's said to have probably died of the plague. So that's it for this episode. If you've lasted this long, thank you. I hope you'll subscribe if you haven't already, and give me a thumbs up and maybe a comment. And I hope you'll come back next time. Until then, be seeing you.